Thank you, Kerlig, and thank you very much, Senators, for your contributions. Just in relation to Storm Bara, which was mentioned at the outset, I just want to say that the government has been informed that there are a number of businesses that have incurred damage as a consequence of the storm due to water and wind damage. Most companies will be covered by their insurance, but where companies weren't able to get insurance, they will be eligible for financial aid from my department. We have restructured the scheme. It was previously a scheme run through the Red Cross and the Department of Defence. That has now been transferred to my department and will be run by the local enterprise offices in each individual county, but will be funded through my department, and will open the scheme in the coming days, and certainly no later than Tuesday of next week if it's needed. In relation to the employment wage subsidy scheme, I just want to say that I have heard the calls from senators here today and also from the hospitality and entertainment sector, where there's a strong preference that we restore the employment wage subsidy scheme back to the rate that was paid in November. There is a difficulty in this. More than half of the businesses and more than half of the jobs supported by the employment wage subsidy scheme are not in the hospitality, arts or event sectors. They're actually in sectors that have not been affected by the imposition of restrictions: construction, retail, administration, education, for example. Ideally, we would like to make the employment wage subsidy scheme sector specific. The Minister of Finance and the Revenue Commissioners tell me that cannot be done. I told them to double check and come back to me because I don't want to find out that it can be done all of a sudden. So Minister Donoghue and the Revenue Commissioners are still working on that possibility as things stand. But the current advice is that it can't be done on a sectoral basis, and we don't want to give most of the money to companies that don't really need it. In fact, companies that do now need to have that financial support wound down over the next few months. And there is, of course, a bigger picture here that people will acknowledge. The performance of the Irish economy, while it varies from sector to sector, in the round has been extraordinary. The budget deficit this year will be a fraction of what we thought it would be. There are 2.4 million people at work in Ireland now again, almost as many as before the pandemic. We're facing labour shortages across the economy. More business people tell me that they can't get staff than the opposite. And my department is facing a huge backlog of work permit applications because we've seen a surge in applications for work permits, because not only can employers not find staff, they can't even find them in Europe. They now have to go beyond the European Union and the European Economic Area to find staff. So that's the broader context in which we're operating. And we have to make sure that if we're going to give wage supports to any companies, it goes to the companies that need it, not just across the board, because that just doesn't make sense for reasons senators will understand. So we want to use, if we can't use the employment wage subsidy scheme on a sectoral basis, we're going to use the CRIS on a sectoral basis to target those companies and businesses and workers that are now adversely affected by these restrictions. And we are examining the €5,000 cap. Now, that is far too low for medium to large companies. We get that. The employment wage subsidy didn't have a cap. And also the 50% turnover rule isn't going to work, particularly because of the distorting effect of December. And we are aware that the figure of 30% is the one that we use for the employment wage subsidy scheme. So Minister Donoghue is examining all of that at the moment. Will hopefully be in a position to make an announcement tomorrow. It may require primary legislation, but thankfully the finance bill is currently in the Seanad, where it actually can be amended, I believe, to provide for things like this. And it may well be the fact that we need to use the vehicle of the Senate to do that in the next couple of days. If not, we may be able to do it in the new year. But even beyond that, we are going to need some sectoral schemes. So Minister Catherine Martin and I are working together on a few possibilities there, reopening the live performance scheme, reopening the events sector scheme, and also some bespoke tourism schemes as well. And we're making some good progress on that at the moment. I did take note of Senator Keoghan's remarks on COVID, and I do hear what the Senator is saying. I welcome a debate on these matters. I don't like to see people being browbeaten when it comes to any sort of debate on these matters. And we've had to change our mind and change our strategy when it comes to COVID so many times that we should never discount the possibility that we might need to do so again. We're all still learning around the world as to what the right approach to COVID is. Any country that appears to be doing the best in the world, within 6 weeks they're not. What does that tell you? It tells you that we still don't know what the right approach to dealing with COVID is, and it's only when the pandemic is over and we can look back on what worked and what didn't that we really know that for sure. We just tried to make the best decisions with the best advice and best information available. and the science on this is changing. And I do try to keep an open mind on these things and do critical thinking on COVID strategy. So anytime anybody comes to me and says that they want to impose new restrictions, whether it's restrictions that will cause a business to close, people to lose their jobs, or individuals or families to have their freedoms reduced, I'm always going to ask questions, and I'm always going to ask for evidence, and I'm always going to ask if there are alternatives. And while some people may be critical of me for doing that, I think it's a good thing that we have people in government, and it certainly isn't just me, that we have people in government who are going to ask those questions and look for evidence and ask for alternatives, and will need to be convinced of the facts before we'll agree to imposing restrictions that affect people's lives and businesses and jobs and freedoms. In relation to the COVID pass and the vaccine passes, I think there is actually good evidence that the vaccine passes have worked. At the very least, they've encouraged more and more people to get vaccinated. I'm not sure we would have reached so high a level of vaccination as 93 or 94% were it not for the COVID pass system, and there's good evidence that countries that have it have higher levels of vaccination. And I think at the very least it's worked on that level. If it hasn't perhaps been as effective as we hoped in terms of transmission, it's certainly been effective in encouraging people to get vaccinated. And we're seeing people who aren't vaccinated yet still coming to get vaccinated now for the first time, and that is encouraging. In relation to the pandemic unemployment payment, at its peak, 650,000 people were in receipt of that payment. That's now down to about 65,000. So 9 out of 10 people who needed that payment are now back at work. And I think it's important that we acknowledge that fact. But when it comes to that 60 or 65,000, those who are still on the pandemic employment payment, most now for more than a year, in some cases nearly 2 years, we are now engaging with them individually to help them with job search, to offer education opportunities, to offer training opportunities, and also the Department of Social Protection is doing its job, making sure that these people are still resident in the country, because all aren't, and making sure that people aren't working and claiming at the same time. And we do all know that there is a degree of that, even if it isn't a very large number, it is a number nonetheless. And I do think that group is different to those who are now being laid off all of a sudden for the second or third time, and that is why a different treatment is being applied. Just in relation to January 9th, I know some senators expressed the hope that restrictions could be lifted before then. I hope so too, but I don't anticipate that being the case. And certainly my message to the industries that I met yesterday was don't operate on the basis that restrictions will be eased before the 9th of January. And I think we probably shouldn't raise expectations in that regard, because of 3 reasons why we've reimposed these restrictions: increased social mixing in the run-up to Christmas, which may increase the caseload. That's almost certainly going to happen. The flu season, that's almost certainly going to happen. Hopefully not a bad one, but it's probably going to happen. And uncertainty about Omicron. I'm not sure we'll be certain about Omicron as soon as the 9th of January. So I think we need to operate on the basis that these restrictions will be in place at least until the 9th of January. And generally, in our experience with the pandemic, when restrictions are imposed, they tend to be extended, not reversed sooner than the date designated. And that's why I think we need to bear that in mind. Anytime I hear anyone say it's just for a few weeks in this pandemic, I always say right back to them, how many times have you said that? And it turned out to be for a few months. And that's why we should always make decisions mindful of the fact that what might appear to be a temporary measure can be one that lasts for months and even years. And we must always bear that in mind. I think Senator Crowe mentioned the idea of a task force on the long-term future of the hospitality sector. I think that's a good idea, by the way. We perhaps should try and get a clearer picture of where we're going with the pandemic before we do that, but I think it is something we should do in 2022. But I do really hope that 2022 is going to be the year where we move away from restrictions on business and restrictions on personal freedoms and on social life to what's called a vaccine plus strategy. And that's using vaccines, it's using the new treatments that's going to be available, it's using isolating people who are sick, much more testing, and we're doing that, more hospital bed capacity, more ICU capacity, we're doing all those things, things like masks and ventilation, and trying to use all of those things together as being enough to keep the virus and the pandemic under control, and therefore not having to use restrictions on business or people's freedoms. And I hope we'll get to that point in 2022. Just in relation to schools, I just want to say that there are no plans to close schools early, and the plan is to open schools as normal in January. There's an active debate about the mid-term break in October. It does seem that the mid-term break around October, which was for schools and colleges, might have actually led to an increase in cases. The truth is when kids are in school, they tend to only mix with the kids in their class and maybe their parents at home and their nuclear family. When schools are out, there's an argument that people actually start mixing and travelling and encountering groups that they wouldn't otherwise be mixing with. So it might actually be better to keep the schools operating until they're supposed to anyway, and not bring forward the break for that reason. But obviously that there are arguments both ways on that. On the issue of statutory sick pay, just want to say this is a personal priority of mine. One of the things I had the privilege to do as Minister for Social Protection was bring in paternity benefit and paternity leave. Had the privilege of, as Health Minister, working with Kathleen Lynch to bring in free GP care for the under sixes, and I hope in my time in office as Minister for Enterprise, Trade and Employment I'll have the privilege to bring in the first statutory sick pay scheme here in Ireland. It was delayed, but it's now not with us, it is with the committee, and as soon as the committee get back to us we'll get it into the House and hopefully enacted by the Dáil Channel without delay. But I do want to phase it in. You know, we do need to bear in mind that for a lot of employers, particularly small employers, this will be an added cost. And if you're running a barber shop or you're running a small shop in rural, urban or suburban Ireland, if you've a member of staff out sick, you have to pay them and you have to pay the replacement. You know, it does all add up, and I do want to be sensitive to that and understand that explanation from business, and that's why I do want to phase it in over time, and that is the intention to do so. And I also need to bear in mind, in particular, businesses along the border. We're introducing a sick pay scheme that's going to pay up to €110 a day. In the 6 counties of Northern Ireland, it's £90 a week. People south of the border will receive more in sick pay in one day than they would get an entire week north of the border. And that's a risk. That's a risk for businesses that are along the border in particular. And I really would appeal to the Sinn Féin party in particular, which co-chairs the government in Northern Ireland, rather than saying that we're not doing enough here, maybe do the same in Northern Ireland, and that might help to take away some of the arguments for a better scheme here south of the border. On the TIPS bill, the intention is that we'll have transparency around service charges, so restaurants or anybody imposing a service charge will have to say what's done with it, whether it goes to staff or whether it goes elsewhere. And when it comes to tips or gratuities, that they will go to staff and can't be used to make up wages. Just on the issue of pay, generally speaking, pay across the Irish economy has been rising for many years and rising ahead of inflation. We don't know if that's going to be the case this year. Inflation's running at about 5%. There's some indications that in the round, this isn't the case for everyone of course, but in the round we're going to see pay increases of between 5 and 7% this year, which is significant. And I do think the claim that Ireland is a low pay economy is actually a little misleading. If you look at our minimum wage, if you compare like with like, if you look at our minimum wage, it's one of the highest in the world. Compare what a nurse in Ireland is paid to Britain or elsewhere in Europe, a Garda, a doctor, a cleaner, a construction worker, you'll see that generally speaking our pay rates are actually in the higher level when you compare us with other countries in Europe and other countries around the world. Yes, if you adjust that for cost of living, it doesn't look so good because the cost of living in Ireland is high. If you then adjust it for personal taxes, which are relatively low in Ireland, it looks a bit better. But to say we're a low pay economy, I think only stacks up based on relativities. And that's not because we're a low pay economy, it's because we have a lot of people on high pay, generally working in multinationals, and that distorts the picture. And I think that claim of Ireland being a low pay economy is misleading. When you compare like for like, that's really not the case. On the EU minimum wage directive, the government is broadly supportive now of the current text. And there have been some changes made that have largely laid our concerns. Just on the issue of vaccine equity and global vaccine justice, I just want to state for the record that the government is a very strong supporter of vaccine equity in the world. Morally, we need to make sure that the world is vaccinated. How do we defeat smallpox, polio? We didn't do it in one country, we did it on an international basis, and that's what we need to do with COVID as well. And it's also in our interest to do so because any country that is not fully vaccinated is a reservoir for potential reinfection. So it is the right thing to do, even from a self-interested point of view. What's the evidence of this? We've donated 2 million vaccines to other countries. They've already arrived in Uganda and Nigeria. Irish people have been enormously generous through the UNICEF campaign the Get a Vaccine, Donate a Vaccine. I've done that myself. We're contributing to COVAX. My department and I have consistently opposed export bans. Other countries that have been a little bit preachy recently, like the United States and other European countries, supported export bans. They wouldn't allow vaccines to be exported from their countries. We always opposed export bans. And through our aid programmes, we're helping in practical ways, with refrigeration, with distribution, with administration, with regulation, because all of those things are necessary in the vaccine programme. But I do agree that Western governments need to do more, need to do a lot more, and certainly as part of the European Union, and this is a European competence, by the way, it's not an Irish competence, it's a European competence, we're very strong advocates of what's called compulsory licensing. So that's allowing governments to license the production of vaccines on a generic basis, whether the pharmaceutical companies like it or not. And that could be very useful to countries like South Africa and India that have vaccine-making capacity, that they would be allowed to license the production of those vaccines in their plants, in their countries, whether those companies like it or not. And that's what we are supporting and advocating as a European Union. On the alternative suggestion of a TRIPS waiver, I have an open mind on that. I've always said that if we receive a proposal in writing in the WTO, we'll look at it. That hasn't happened yet. Met Catherine Tai, the USTR, said we'd happily look at a proposal if one lands. It hasn't yet. But I do think it is being misrepresented a little bit as a panacea, as a bit of a magic wand. And the truth is the TRIPS waiver won't result in a single vaccine plant being built in Mali or Mauritania or Malawi this year, next year or the year after. It takes 2 or 3 years to build a vaccine plant. And then you need to staff it, and then you need to quality control it. So what actually is needed is capacity, know-how, qualified scientists and technicians, capital, experience, medicines and safety regulators. You need all of those things to get the vaccine from the lab into people's arms. And that's why it's better, I think, to have governments and pharmaceutical companies working together to find a solution rather than trying to create conflicts and turn one against the other. I don't think that's the right approach. So we do need a global solution, one that's comprehensive, one that's intelligent, one that's workable, one that doesn't disincentivise innovation. We are going to be asking these companies to produce the vaccines against the variants, by the way, so we don't want to disincentivise innovation. And I do hope, picking up on Senator Ward's remarks, that when we have a debate about these things, it can be a reasoned one and a factual one. We shouldn't have to question each other's motivations or bona fides. That demeans us all, in my view. Just finally, I want to say I'm very struck with what senators had to say in relation to the arts sector in this debate, and I very much agree. The meeting with the sector yesterday was a very difficult one. I think what we were greeted with was more a sense of dismay than anger, a sense that certain sectors, including the arts entertainment sector, have faced one of the longest lockdowns in the world, real uncertainty about what's going to happen next spring, next summer, and a real feeling that they've been kind of left behind and maybe sacrificed in order to save other sectors in the economy. And I have to say, and as I said to them yesterday, when it comes to the hospitality sector, arts, events and entertainment, these sectors are not to blame in any way for the pandemic. The virus is to blame. And it just so happens that this particular virus transmits in settings where there's a lot of people gathered. And unlike education or healthcare or childcare or food production or manufacturing, these are sectors that public health officials describe as being discretionary activities and therefore can be closed. And in many ways, they are sectors that are now taking a hit to protect the rest of society. And that's why we have a moral obligation to protect them financially and also to make sure that they can survive and come through the other side. But any time I hear that term, discretionary activity, I find it very hard to stomach, quite frankly, because I think to me, and I think to a lot of people here in this house, life without music, sport, comedy, drama, nightlife, beast, festivals, life without these things really isn't a life worth living in the long term, because it's culture and sport that makes us human. It makes us feel that we belong, it allows us to express ourselves, allows us to escape, and we really need to do that from time to time, allows us to explore, and allows us to engage with people who we otherwise would never engage with. And we really need to get these sectors open, in my view, as soon as is possible and safe in the new year, whether it involves testing or ventilation or maybe things we haven't thought about in the past. And if capacity is restricted, and it may well be throughout the course of the winter, well, then we need to put in place subsidies to allow performances to go ahead, even if that means paying half the ticket price or something like that, because I know, talking to the sector, what they've said to me is if you can fit 100 people in standing, seated, you're only going to fit 30, and it's just not viable. And we need to consider subsidies and financial supports to at least allow these sectors to operate and people to practice their art and enjoy art and culture again in the new year, because it has been far too long. And again, I thank senators for their comments.